First of all, would you please welcome our first speaker on the conscription crisis, the fight for citizenship, Dr. Ciarán Wallace.
Thanks, Ordera, and thanks for the invitation to speak. It's a bit of a thrill to be in this room at this moment on this day, so I'm particularly pleased to be here. To understand the events, any historical events, it's important to understand their context. The Dublin Lockout, the Home Rule Act, the emergence of the Ulster Volunteers, the Rising were all local Irish events, but they were embedded in broader contexts. So too with the conscription crisis. I want to talk briefly about the conscription's historical context, broader geographical context, and then the context of the anti-conscription movement, sort of kind of outside Ireland. As Ordera has referred, Ireland had experienced a form of conscription before, or this topic had crossed our paths before. As far back as 1793, the Dublin Parliament passed a Militia Act, which allowed conscription for local defence by using a ballot system. Now, riots broke out in response to this Militia Ballot Act, but it actually took, and as Tim Bowman of the University of Kent pointed out, this act helped to familiarise many Irish Catholics with army life and partly accounts for the very high numbers of Irish Catholics that served in the British Army in the 19th century. Skipping forward a century to the end of the Second South African or Boer War in 1902, the British military were very concerned about the low number and poor quality of army recruits, and this resulted in a public fitness campaign and in the Boy Scout movement and various social plans like that. A government report into the army, the British Army, proposed compulsory universal military training in response to this need. Now, the idea did not take off, but the debate about compulsion and the military rumbled on through the early 1900s. Stories about compulsion and resistance appeared in national and provincial newspapers here in Ireland, and months before the outbreak of the war, in January 1914, the Derry Journal, for instance, reported on problems faced by the London Territorial, one of these territorial defence units, in attracting recruits. And their chairman, their senior officer, Field Marshal Wood, declared the defence of the kingdom could only be achieved by universal compulsory military training. In March 14, the Irish Independent reported that young men in Australia were avoiding that country's new compulsory military training regulation. There had been 21,000 prosecutions of young guys not turning up for their compulsory registration, compulsory training. And that report in the Independent mentioned the presence of conscientious objectors. So these themes are in the air. The same month, a letter writer to the Leinster Express rejoiced that the National Service League, this was a British campaigning body set up to campaign for conscription for home defence of the United Kingdom. So this league had failed to win public support, and the letter writer to the Leinster Express was rejoicing in this failure, and he said that the league's promise that recruits would only be deployed at home was laughable. Basically, anybody enrolled in any military service was, by the very nature of that enrolment, going to end up serving overseas. In April 14, the International Arbitration League, this is a British pacifist group with Labour roots, worried that a military conspiracy headed by Lord Roberts and other leading conscriptionists might raise a conscript army to be used against striking workers. So in various ways, in various parts of the world, you see pre-war awareness of conscription shown in the Irish media. When the war began here in August 1914, people feared that the Militia Ballot Act of 1793 might actually be reactivated. In fact, they were right to be afraid because it had never been taken off the statute books. In theory, it was still available. The Evening Herald in October 1914, a couple of months into the war, had an article set out by a barrister explaining the law and why it was still valid and how it could be introduced, how it could be sort of reactivated pretty instantly. However, the flood of volunteers from England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales kept Kitchener's army well supplied with soldiers for the opening phases of the war. But as the global scale and the true cost of the conflict emerged, the government was forced to reconsider, or to consider a most un-British notion, that of raising a conscript army. Is this my... Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Gotcha. Conscript army, yeah. In January 1916, the Military Service Act introduced conscription for unmarried men in Britain between 18 and 41 years of age. Now, initially, widowers with children, clergy and workers in reserved occupations were exempted from this regulation, but in May 1916, only a few months later, the rules were extended to include married men, and by 1918 the upper age limit was shifted up to 51, so it's an incremental law. This 1916 Act was not applied to Ireland. The Home Rule Act, shelved at the start of the war, promised Ireland a semi-independent dominion status, somewhat similar to Canada or Australia, and conscription was seen as a question for dominion parliaments themselves. By early 1916, it was generally accepted that Ireland would erupt in opposition if Westminster introduced conscription here, as the Lord Bearer has referred. Richard Hazelton, Irish Parliamentary Party MP for North Louth, addressed a rally in December 1915 and said, "No matter what happened in England, conscription is impossible in this country. It was not more competent for Britain to impose it on them than it could on Canada, and the effort to impose it on Ireland would be nothing short of a declaration of war and open up the bitterest feud that had ever arisen between these countries." So prescient, but that idea was there. Likewise, a British politician, speaking at the same time, described Ireland as an ally of Britain in the war, which is an interesting choice of words. While the British government had the right, he said, in an emergency to call on the treasure and services of all citizens, Ireland was morally a separate entity, and this has been recognised as such by the Home Rule Act. There was also geographic context to conscription. It had been part of Australian life since 1903. Men between 18 and 60 were liable for service in time of war, but only within the Commonwealth. And as the Great War progressed, many more troops were needed for service in Europe and the Middle East. How do I make this go forward? Next slide, please. Okay. Is this?
The green.
The green, gotcha, okay. It's the obvious green one, bigger than my thumb, sorry folks. Australia, as Great War progressed, many more troops were needed for service in Europe and the Middle East, and the Australian government wanted to introduce conscription now for foreign service. A referendum was held in October 1916, and this resulted in 1 million votes in favour of conscription in Australia and 1.1 million against. There was a general election in Australia in May 1917, and a new Australian National Party emerged. This is a merger of National Labour and the Liberals, so there was a big shift in Australian politics caused by this question and caused by the war. They tried again with a different wording, a second referendum, and voters rejected conscription the second time by a larger majority than before. This is just some campaign material. God knows we're familiar with campaign material around referendums in this country, but it's interesting to see the different motivations. I just picked these two at random. There's many arguments for and against on both sides, but the posters, some are showing fear of the Kaiser, and others are showing kind of a racially motivated reason not to introduce conscription, but there were many other reasons. The situation in New Zealand was different. Greg Hines, a New Zealander working in Britain at the moment, has done interesting work on the Maori population and conscription in New Zealand. Now, compulsory military training had been enforced for white New Zealanders, or Pakeha as they're called now, since 1909, but the Maori population was not included. In the early years of the Great War, voluntary recruitment of Maori was largely left in their own hands. The New Zealand government reluctantly allowed a Maori contingent to be raised, and they were deployed to Egypt. But when conscription was introduced in New Zealand in August 1916, it was not particularly contentious. There was no major social division over it. Indeed, resentment at low rates of voluntary enlistment had produced calls for conscription amongst both Pakeha, white and Maori populations in the country. Some Maori groups that produced far more volunteers campaigned that their brethren and other groups who weren't volunteering should be conscripted because they weren't producing enough soldiers. And the responses to conscription amongst the Maori were quite diverse. Some resisted, just did not want it. Others saw it as a mark of racial equality and of full citizenship. And there were calls for the process of conscription to be tailored to Maori cultural and familial norms to organise their particular community organisations. Ultimately, very few Maori men were taken and none actually served in the event. Michael Joseph, a young British West Indian researcher working on this question at the moment, he's working on the conscription controversy and constitutional reform in the British West Indies. Now, the French West Indies had had conscription since 1913, and a proposal to introduce it in the British West Indies caused their conscription crisis around March 1917, about a year ahead of our conscription crisis. The West Indies includes this set of islands here and more beyond, but they were governed as crown colonies since the 1870s. So they had a local governor imposed from Westminster, and that was a governor in your sort of colonial house in your island. Many islanders saw this form of administration through colonial governors as implying second-class citizenship, and the conscription debate heightened that sense of irritation. So again, conscription as a kind of a catalyst, as an abrasive. Conscription, they felt, would clarify the islanders' British citizenship. Nationalist leaders, indeed, said they would accept conscription from Westminster, but not from a colonial governor. Press coverage in the islands shows an awareness of the conscription debates in Australia and in Ireland. So it's a global event. People are we don't think of ourselves today as being connected. People were connected by newspapers all around the globe. And again, despite the controversy, no British West Indian conscript ever actually served at the front. So again, it failed to really happen in the BWI. Canada's population was about 1/3 French, 2/3 UK origin, and there was a high level of enlistment amongst British Canadians with a lower level amongst French Canadians. Initially, public opinion in Canada saw conscription as not being British. It wasn't part of the British tradition. But the Battle of Vimy Ridge from the 9th to the 12th of April 1917 was a totemic moment in Canadian history. 3,500 men were killed in 4 days and 7,000 wounded. So for a new country with a new army, this was a huge, huge shock. The Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden wanted to introduce conscription, and he formed a union or coalition government to secure a mandate and give moral authority to his new policy. Now, Borden won the khaki election, and you hear khaki elections in lots of countries during the war and just after the war. Borden won the khaki election of December 1917 and introduced compulsory military service in Canada. Riots and civil divisions erupted between British and French Canadians, but by Easter 1918, around the time of our conscription crisis, there were 24,000 conscripts already raised in Canada. Not a huge number, but they did impose it, they did manage to roll it out. Canadian anti-conscriptionists supported the war and very often supported the British link, but they feared ethical damage. They feared it was an unethical social decision to make. They feared social divisions in Canada, which is a multi-ethnic society, and the effect on minority rights. So there were quite sort of varied and complex reasons to oppose conscription. Their fears were right, because conscription did split Canadian politics along linguistic lines, and the Liberal Party was destroyed as a national movement, becoming basically a Quebec-based party for the rest of the century. So again, conscription has a big political impact on a country. Local factors in Canada were important. Irish Catholics in the west of the country, where the war was popular, tended to vote pro-conscription, but in the French areas where it was less popular and less enthusiasm for the war, the Irish were anti-conscriptionist. Opposition to compulsory military service had its own context. Anti-conscription activists might support the war, might support the British Empire, and their activism could be driven by a range of motives. In Britain, conscription had traditionally been seen as a continental practice, somehow not part of the British tradition, okay for Germans or French, but not for us. So when the need for a conscript army arose during the Great War, public opinion had to come to terms with this big change. Indeed, in January 1916, John Dillon, deputy leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, argued against conscription in Britain, saying he could see no justification for, quote, this great departure from the steady practice of England unbroken over 300 years. So this notion of it's a huge change for sort of the British political and military tradition. To ameliorate the introduction of conscription, this idea of conscientious objections, military tribunals, and basically certain people could be exempted from military service was introduced. But that introduction itself had a longer context. Back as far as the 1880s, legislation introducing compulsory childhood vaccination against smallpox had produced a small but voluble opposition who objected to the state's interference in the private decisions of a parent about their own child. And a conscientious objection clause was introduced in this smallpox regulation, allowing a citizen to explain their moral or ethical objections in front of a local tribunal who could then exempt them from the vaccination law. This model of conscientious objection, using that word, and local tribunal provided the model for dealing with conscientious objectors to military conscription in World War I. Conscription did not actually solve the Army's manpower problems, because furthermore, the military service tribunals, probably intended to be a kind of a sop to the public opinion, turned out to be a bit of a thorn in the side of the military. Over 200,000 applications were put in front of tribunals in Britain. Widowers, sole traders, essential workers and others presented various non-conscientious reasons for objecting to military service, and tribunals often agreed with them. So it's perhaps surprising to us to think that in a total war context, the army was not the top priority. Shipping and agriculture could have ranked it as being essential to national survival. In Britain, Quakers, Plymouth Brethren and other non-conformist sects were amongst the most prominent conscientious objectors on religious grounds and ethical grounds. Some refused cooperation whatsoever with the war effort, others objected to killing but would serve in the ambulance corps or similar support units. Many socialists argued that conscription gave the state and capitalist class an additional tool with which to control workers. A larger military could repress strikes in future. But a socialist need not object to soldiering as such if it was for the right cause. They objected to involvement in what they saw as the wrong war, a war which did nothing to advance the cause of labour. Thus enforced participation was doubly offensive. One issue common to responses to conscription around the world is the relationship between citizenship and the state, and this is something that's kind of interested me in preparing for this. Before the war, in March 1914, in a debate on conscription in the House of Lords, the Irish Unionist politician Lord Middleton called for schools to teach the advantages and obligations of British citizenship. Advantages and obligations. This link between conscription and citizenship was evident from Britain to the West Indies, New Zealand and Canada. Conscientious objectors in New Zealand and in Britain, for instance, lost the right to vote, a key marker of citizenship. But it was not just a British Empire problem. Puerto Rico was an American dependency, US dependency at the time. In March of 1917, an act of Congress made all Puerto Ricans United States citizens without rescinding their Puerto Rican citizenship. 2 months later, Congress passed a conscription law and conscripted all the serviceable men of serviceable age. In Tsarist Russia, conscription was limited to European Russians but did not apply to native Siberians or to the Muslims of Central Asia. Some of these excluded people sought or campaigned to get conscription for the perceived citizenship which it conferred. So there's an interesting kind of dynamic going on there. I believe that this question of citizenship is also the key behind the Irish anti-conscription movement. For a generation or more, the Home Rule campaign had involved a sort of blended citizenship model where you could be both Irish and British in whichever proportion suited best. I think that's evident in this poster, World War I recruiting poster. This is the version as shown as posted up on railway stations, let's say, in Britain. Come into the ranks, king and country, the flag, the civilians in the front row, join the uniformed ranks behind. The same one adapted for Ireland, it's kind of spot the difference. So you can see what's been taken away and what's been added. What's been added is the Home Rule Parliament and the Home Rule flag. What's been taken away is your king and country. So they urgently need soldiers, and this is a marketing advertising campaign, but interesting politics are kind of reflected in this. I believe this question is important. In excluding Ireland from conscription in January 1916, the government acknowledged and amplified the difference in understanding of what it meant to be a British citizen, a difference between Britain's understanding and Ireland's understanding. After 3.5 years of apparently pointless war, with its losses and anxieties, rationing, shortages and militarisation of Irish society, after the disappointment of the shelved Home Rule Act, the shock of the Easter Rising and the severity of the British response, the sense of citizenship had, for many in Ireland, become dislodged. By 1918, conscription had crystallised the issue. It was the wrong army, in the wrong war, but crucially being imposed by the wrong parliament. Thank you very much.
Ciarán, thanks very much for that very interesting presentation, and I think I was particularly interested in the international perspective